Peace be with you and with your spirit. Welcome to another episode of St. Anthony's Tongue. I am your host, W. So St. Francis of Assisi is one of the most beloved saints of all time. And yet, I also think he's one of the most misunderstood. Because over the centuries, we've commercialized St. Francis. We've stripped him of his humanity. We've stripped him of his depth. And we kind of made him into this caricature. This hippie, nature-loving saint. Is there some truth to that? Sure. But in doing so, we forget his depth. And if this sounds familiar to you, I did cover this in my recent episode, The Dark Side of St. Francis, where I discuss his suffering, his pain, his betrayal by his brothers, the stigmata, and so on. And I talked about how he used that as a means to grow closer to Christ. But there's another aspect that I feel as if we've looked over. And that is the mysticism of St. Francis. Now, in the Catholic Church, we do tend to use the word mysticism fairly loosely. To some, a mystic is someone who has written a mystical text. So, Teresa of Avila in her interior castle, John of the Cross in his ascent to Mount Carmel. Or it's someone who had an intense spiritual experience. So the stigmata of Padre Pio, or in the instance of St. Francis, his stigmata. But still, it takes more than just having one experience or writing a book to be a mystic. A mystic, and by the way, a person is rarely going to call themselves a mystic, but a mystic is someone who is transformed by an encounter with God, and thus reveals Christ to the world. And while Francis never wrote a book, we actually don't have many writings of his at all, except a few letters to his brothers. He is one of the most important mystics, simply by how he lived his life. And that's what I want to talk about today. The mystical themes in the life and spirituality of St. Francis. Before we begin talking about the mysticism of St. Francis, I want to remind you his feast day is October 4th. So if you'd like to pray a novena leading up to his feast day, I do have a novena that I wrote and prayer guide that I wrote available in the pinned comment and description of this episode. However, I recommend you check out Patreon. Every Patreon member will also have access to this guide and all of the monthly guides that we do. And on Patreon, we'll be praying for the 9 days leading up to his novena together. I'll be sharing a video praying the novena with you, and also additional stories from his life and many other Franciscan-related things. You can think of it as a mini online retreat that you can do at your own pace. And if you're watching this in the future, don't worry, you can pray this novena anytime. So please consider supporting my work and joining us on Patreon. What does it mean to be a saint? Now you probably think a saint is anyone who has gotten the proper paperwork and now they're canonized by the church, and that's true. Or more generally, you can say a saint is anyone who is in heaven. That is true as well. But I think one of the most powerful and stripped-down definitions of a saint is this. It's someone who revealed Christ to the world through their life. And this is actually one of my favorite things to do when reading about the saints. When I reflect upon their lives, I look and say, how is their story lining up to the story of Christ? And oftentimes, you could even place their lives within the Via Crucis, within the Passion of the Christ, which I think is phenomenal. And we'll be doing that a bit with Francis. And when we do that, when we look at a saint through the lens of Christ's passion, through the lens of suffering, through the lens of pain, we make that saint a little more relatable once again. Because I don't know what it's like to preach to birds, but I do know what it's like to suffer. And we see that in the life of St. Francis. Because in his suffering, through his suffering, he revealed Christ to the world. He became a mirror of Christ. And you've probably heard me use that phrase time and time again. The point of our faith is not just doing everything right and then getting into heaven. No, it's about becoming so transformed by the grace of God that we reveal Christ. So that's the first theme that I want to talk about. It's St. Francis as a mirror of Christ. The only thing that St. Francis wanted to be when he was a young man was a knight. He would roam about Assisi singing songs like a bard, songs about knighthood, songs about maidens, because that's what he wanted more than anything. And he failed at it. Many people don't know this, but St. Francis, he got a chance to try and be a knight. He went off into battle in Perugia, and he was captured. He was captured and held as a prisoner of war for over a year. And there he became sick, traumatized. He also became stripped of those illusions, stripped of those attachments. The only thing he wanted to be in the world was a knight, and now he's realizing this is not the life for me. He's broken down. And that is where mysticism often begins. It often begins in that breaking down, in humiliation, in disillusionment. This is one of the first steps of what St. John of the Cross calls the dark night of the soul, right? In St. John of the Cross, he also experienced something similar. He wanted to just make reforms within the Carmelite order. He was kidnapped by his own brothers, stripped, beaten, whipped publicly in the courtyard of the monastery, humiliated. And it was in St. John of the Cross's darkness that the spiritual canticle, the poetry of God, began to flow forth. So here, in this prison cell, being beaten, humiliated, starved, one could say this is where the mysticism of Francis began. And this is also one of the ways that he mirrors Christ. He endured imprisonment, abandonment, humiliation. Christ felt abandoned. He felt abandoned by the Father. Christ was stripped and beaten. And this stripping and beating, as seen in the scourging of the pillar with Christ, this is indicative of humbling ourselves. Scourging has always been symbolic of humiliation, being humble, getting out of our heads, lowering ourselves. Now, of course, Christ is God. He did not need to humble himself, but he did that on our behalf. But here, Francis is humiliated as well, because sometimes it's getting past those illusions, getting past that ego. Then we can find God. So the Christocentrism of Francis reminds us that mysticism, it doesn't begin with the visions. He has a vision eventually. It begins with suffering. It begins with humbling ourselves, or being forced to humble ourselves. It begins with going low, so Christ can rebuild us. Eventually, Francis would be released from prison. His family paid a ransom. But Francis was never the same. He was distant. He was moody. One could say he was depressed. There are many people who say that his behavior after his imprisonment shows signs of PTSD of some sort. But what we do know is he was not the same Francis. He wasn't this jovial bard of Assisi anymore. He was distant and reserved. So eventually his family thought, well, maybe if you go give war another try, maybe you go try to fight another war, and this time you'll win, and then you'll have your hopes back up of being a knight. But on the way there, on the way to the second battle, he abandons him. He abandons his dream of knighthood. And in that darkness, in that moment, we don't know why he abandoned it. Could it be trauma? Could it be he realized just this isn't the life for him? We don't know, but we do know he stops to pray. He stops to pray in the ruined San Damiano chapel. And it was here, in prayer, on his knees, in front of the San Damiano crucifix, he heard God speak to him. rebuild my church. I want to remind you of the beauty in the word rebuild here, because Francis himself likely felt broken. He likely felt that he himself was in ruin. His dreams of knighthood have been tarnished and destroyed. His self-esteem tarnished and destroyed. You can even wager that his mental health was destroyed. And now God says, rebuild. Rebuild my church. Now, how does this relate to Christ? There's a lot of ways. But I think this echoes the commissioning of the apostles, where Christ sends his people out. So Francis' first encounter with the mystical Christ, it's not rapture. It's not an ecstasy. It's not a St. Teresa of Avila and a pierced heart. It's a mission. Christ doesn't console him. God doesn't send an angel to pat him on the back like Gethsemane. God puts him to work. In this moment, it parallels Peter by the Sea of Galilee, when Christ asks, "Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Rebuild my church." So this reminds us that a mystical encounter with Christ, it doesn't always send us inward. It often sends us outward, out into the world to reveal Christ to everyone, which is such a Franciscan point of view. So Francis now has had this mystical encounter with God. Now, how do we define a mystic? First off, if anyone calls themselves a mystic, I think you need to be a little suspicious of that. A mystic rarely calls themselves that. We call someone else a mystic. And typically one way to define that is someone who has an encounter with God that increases our love of the divine and love of neighbor. And that's what happened here in San Damiano. So he was changed. And he surely had an increased love of neighbor, so much that he did return to his father's merchant shop, and he would take the money from the register and go give it to those that were begging on the street corners. Or he would take some of the money from his family business and use it to start rebuilding the church in San Damiano. And his father eventually didn't know what to do with Francis. He was frantic. He was obsessed now with God and religious things. He was giving all their money away. So at one point, his father even locked him in a room. Eventually, he would escape. Some say this was angelic intervention. Most other people say his mother just was very sympathetic and let him out. But it was then he realized he could not live with his family anymore. He could not be with this family. He loved them, but he could not be in the world anymore. So he brought his family into the town square, and he renounced his inheritance. And that was the main worry of the father, was that if he died, the money would go to his son, who was becoming this holy fool, who was becoming this holy wanderer. So that needed to be settled. So in the town square, formally in front of the bishop, Francis denounces his inheritance and denounces his family name. But he took it a step further. Francis removed his cloak, and he stood there naked. The bishop had to cover Francis's naked body with his own cloak, with his own bishop robe. So here Francis mirrors Christ's words when Christ says, "He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me." Here Francis says, my family, they don't understand me. And my devotion is to God first. God is my father. He got rid of that attachment that he knew was stopping him from that command to rebuild his church. But also here, he's stripping away his worldliness. He embodies the naked Christ. Christ, as I said previously, was stripped before his accusers. He was covered in shame. But In Francis' nakedness, he's clothed in Christ. So here we remember that to mirror Christ is sometimes to lose the world's protection. And I'm not saying we must renounce our family, renounce inheritances, and run away and be a holy wanderer, perhaps. But more so, it's understanding that our protection is God, not the world. And the only covering we need is the covering of the divine. And again, I'm not saying walk around naked, but strip away the worldliness. Strip away all of these attachments we have. That is why the mysticism of Francis is so radical. It's not a cloistered mysticism. It's a radical mirroring of Christ. So when Francis was a knight, or when he was in the world being a bard, singing around, doing antics with his friends in Assisi, before he gave all this up to become a brother in the forest, he was always repelled by lepers. He would recoil when he would see them. But now, after running into the wilderness, after renouncing his family name, he starts to embrace lepers. He sees lepers and tends to their wounds, kisses them, hugs them. And of course, this blatantly mirrors Christ as well, because Christ also touched the untouchable. Christ also embraced the lepers. So Francis discovers that mysticism is encounter with others. It's an encounter with Christ in the margins. And this was not sentimentality. This was a mystical experience. Because to Francis, he would see Christ in disguise in the lepers. God hidden in their wounds. God hidden in their pus. God hidden in their rejection. So mirroring Christ is to love and support the lowly. It's finding him where the world hides him. And then, of course, the climax of the mirroring is the stigmata. So eventually Francis, I'm skipping over a lot of his life, would go and make this order that caught the world on fire. It exploded. An order that was centered on radical poverty, on giving everything up, only focused on Christ. No attachments except Jesus and serving Christ and the poor. But eventually, something very interesting happens. And it's something that I was alluding to already. Biographies, the ancient biographies, say that Francis began to feel more like a mascot in his own religious order. His brothers had a lot of opinions on how things should be run. They rewrote the rule behind his back. They had a vote behind his back that stripped him of his power. So now he was just this mascot. And I feel like we do that to Francis here a little bit. We've forgotten the depth that I hope we're uncovering again today. We forgot about the suffering that I hope I helped you uncover a few weeks ago. But he himself felt like a mascot, just a name to get donations. So he wanted to go take a retreat. So he went to Laverna, a chapel in the mountain of Laverna. And as he was reading the gospel, he kept opening it up to the passage of the Passion. And he simply said, God, allow me to suffer like you. Suffer with love. Now, if you read this out of context, you're thinking this is in general. And Francis already does that, and I'm sure he was praying for more. He already has spent his entire life at this point suffering for others, loving others with suffering. But now he's looking at the Passion, and this is very important and often overlooked. He's looking at the Passion, and he's being mocked, he's being beaten. So sure, I think Francis probably says, God, allow me to love in my suffering like you, but I think he was also thinking about his brothers who betrayed him. And in that moment he said, God, allow me to love these people who are betraying me. These people that I have been their spiritual mentor, spiritual brother, their friend, they're betraying me. Christ, you died for those who betrayed you. Allow me to love like that. And that is when he had his vision of the seraph, the seraphic angel. And that is when he received his stigmata. So now he wakes up with blood in his palms, his head, his feet, and he crawls. I would say, I like to envision he crawled to the running stream that was outside the chapel. He washes his hands and he watches the blood flow in the current, little wisps of red. And in that moment, he offers up his pain to the same brothers who betrayed him. Because that is what the stigmata is about. And I'll be covering this in my book in 2026, The Catechism of the Strange. But we often forget what the stigmata is. When Christ was crucified on the cross, he offered up his pain and suffering to those away from God. And as Catholics, we believe that we can do the same. In a smaller way, of course. We fast on Fridays. When we fast on Fridays, we offer up our discomfort to those away from God. This is what we're supposed to do. We can also offer up any pain, a stubbed toe, a headache. But here, the stigmatist, so here Francis, he has redemptive suffering on a supernatural level. Because now he's not offering up a stubbed toe or a fast. He's offering up the same pain that Christ went through. And he's offering it up, like Christ, to those away from Jesus. Or in Francis's case, those who betrayed him. So this is the ultimate, the climax of how Francis mirrors Christ in his mysticism. His body has become a living icon of Christ crucified. So now, look at the circle. The prison cell to the wounds. Humiliation to transfiguration. Francis is not just imitating Christ externally. In this moment, he is united mystically with him. So this is the pattern of mirroring Christ when we see it in Francis. Because remember, what is a mystic? What is a saint? Someone who mirrors Christ. So the prisoner, the humiliation, this is Christ bound and imprisoned. Francis was imprisoned, so was Christ. The vision at Damiano, go rebuild my church. This mirrors the commissioning, Christ sending forth his disciples. Francis stripping before his Father. This is Christ stripping before his accusers. Francis hugged the lepers. Christ healed the lepers. And the stigmata and the crucifixion. So, Francis's mysticism is not abstract contemplation. It's going out. Going out. It's living the gospel so fully that his life became Christ's life. Come on, buddy. Hi, everyone. Toulouse the cat is going to help me talk about, very apt for the Francis episode, buddy. I know. So let's talk about the second theme of Francis's mysticism, and this is what many people think of when they talk about St. Francis. And this is creation as a mystical dialogue. Because to Francis, he didn't just talk about nature because he thought nature was neat. To Francis, nature was one of the many ways that God speaks to us. God works through creation, through nature. And this is seen in the mystical concept of the cosmic priesthood. So Francis actually stands in a stream of Eastern fathers, like Maximus the Confessor, but also Western too, the Franciscan Bonaventure also speaks about this. But the cosmic priesthood is humanity's role in lifting things back up to God. So I'm going to be simplifying a very, very rich and kind of heady theology here. But to summarize it, the cosmic priesthood is this. You and I, we are born the lowest rung of spirit, the highest rung of matter. Angels and spirits, they cannot grasp matter. They can't pluck an apple from a tree. They can't feel the grass under their toes. Therefore, and this is in Genesis, one of our goals here as human beings is to experience matter, experience life, and simply lift it back up to God. Therefore, simply enjoying a sunset and offering it up to God in thanksgiving, enjoying food and offering it up to God in thanksgiving. This is an act of liturgy, and this is called the cosmic priesthood. That is why the Canticle of Daniel talks about at the end of time, everything will praise the Lord. Dolphins, water creatures, flowers will all praise the Lord. And that's the cosmic priesthood. So it's our role in taking creation and lifting it up to God. So Bonaventure, in his journey of the mind into God, so he was very much a Franciscan. He's a doctor of the church, I believe. But the Franciscan Bonaventure, he reminds us that creation is a ladder of ascent, and every creature is a trace pointing to the Creator. So Bonaventure, in this very Franciscan way, reminds us that everything around us is a glimpse of God. The flowers, trees, animals, they point towards God. This is also found in a very unexpected place. This is found in St. John of the Cross's spiritual canticle. And Pope Francis talked about this in Laudato Si. In the spiritual canticle, St. John of the Cross, the lover, which stands for the soul, goes and seeks the beloved. She cannot find him, but she's searching in the forest, and she sees glimpses, traces of him in the birds, in the flowers, in the sky, in the trees. And she thinks to herself, if all of these things remind me of God's beauty, then how much more beautiful is God in totality? And then she has this ecstatic experience, you could say, or she's left with a, quote, I don't know what behind my stammering. She's left in an awe state of God. But Bonaventure says this before John of the Cross. He reminds us that everything is pointing back to the Creator. So Francis embodies this. He embodies the creation as cosmic liturgy. He doesn't just admire the sun. He lets the sun draw him upward in praise, fulfilling the priestly vocation of humanity. So Francis reminds us that creation is a sacrament. Creation are visible signs that carry us into union with the invisible God. And I think that's very powerful. I do have some previous episodes that are audio only on nature mysticism. I do want to revisit those themes soon. But another theme, and we just celebrated her feast day not too long ago, or yesterday, as I'm recording this, and that's St. Hildegard of Bingen, who was about 100, maybe 200 years before Francis, the great abbess, doctor of the church, and mystic. She talked about what she called the Veriditas, which she called the greening power of God. Basically, to Hildegard, God's grace fills us with a greening, with a springtime, with a blossoming of our soul. Therefore, to Hildegard, the point of our faith is to ensure our soul has greening. So the grace greens us, but sin and vice, it makes us brittle, rigid, sterile. And Francis, without saying it, but he alludes to it in his canticles, he also lived in what Hildegard called this greenness, this Veriditas. Because he also saw every creature alive with God's breath, verdant with grace. Brother, sun, sister, moon. And even as his body decayed, I talk about his blindness in my previous episode. We don't often talk about that. But as he grew blind, that's when he sang the most of creation's greatness. When he was going blind, that's when he finished his Canticle of the Sun. So Hildegard, she painted these beautiful cosmic visions. And that's how she portrayed this greening, this mystical reality. But Francis, he enacted it with his poverty, He stood small among green things, praising with them, praying with them. So as I said earlier, the Canticle of the Sun, sometimes called Canticle of the Creatures, but he wrote this when he was going blind, when he was sick. He wrote this when he was near death. And his body was barren, but his soul had that greening. It was verdant, it was alive. And in that moment, he praises brother sun, sister moon, fire, water, even sister death. And this is that cosmic priesthood in practice. Because at the end of his life, he recognizes that creation is already praising God. And he joins his own broken voice to theirs, his own faltering voice to the magnificence of creation. So he's just not praising the sun, moon, and stars, he's praying with them. And this reminds us that true mysticism, it doesn't remove you from the material world. It doesn't remove you from creation. It doesn't remove you from myths, but rather true mysticism teaches you to hear the secret liturgy. The secret liturgy in creation, and even beyond it. So, just as Christ emptied himself to take on flesh, Francis emptied himself to stand in kinship with all creatures. In his union with creation, it's not just sentimentality, it's Christological, right? Because Christ is the center. Christ is the Word that became flesh, the inspiration behind all of creation. And all of creation radiates from Christ, radiates from the Word. So Francis here, he enters that radiance. Because, like I said, it all points to God, points to Christ. So seeing how creation points to God, he's partaking in the radiance alongside Christ. So, Francis shows us that mysticism, it's not an escape, but it's integration. And to see Christ in the world, that is to become a cosmic priest. And mystical living, it means praising with creation, not above it. And it's raising the song of the world back to God. So now let's talk about fire, light, and ecstasy. This is another theme from the mysticism of Francis. So out at Mount Laverna during the Stigmata, Francis saw a seraph. This is a burning angel. And this vision is very unique. Many mystics, when they've had the Stigmata, they don't describe this burning angel. But this was Christ who appeared with the fiery wings of a seraph angel. And this is not a random imagery. In Scripture, seraphim, they are the burning ones. These are the angels of Isaiah's vision. These are the angels who set his lips aflame with a coal. So Francis becomes known as the seraphic man, fiery, because true mysticism, it's not tame, it's alive. But moreover, in mystical theology, time and time again, fire, it symbolizes that transforming union. Fire, time and time again, appears, and now I'm thinking, the first one I'm thinking of is St. John of the Cross. The wound of love, it cauterizes, it burns. Also in Scripture, we often hear about refining in purgation, refining ourselves of impurities. So fire symbolizes that union. Fire, in this instance, is the soul set ablaze until it glows with God's light. So Francis saw a burning angel, and he too would burn like that angel. But there's also ecstatic weeping and radiance. So far, we've talked about some of the simple ways that Francis shows us his mysticism, but it's said that sometimes when he prayed, he glowed. He lit up, sometimes even lighting up the night around him. There are a few stories in the Little Flowers of St. Francis, which is largely hagiographical, but it's brothers who are wandering and cannot find the campsite, but Francis is praying, so it lights up the space. In his ecstasies, they often left him sobbing, trembling, or wrapped in silence. And Bonaventure interprets these moments as excessus mentis, or the mind carried beyond itself. And I love that because earlier I gave you the John of the Cross reference when the soul went out into nature and was enraptured by all the glimpses of God. And I'm sure Francis felt that as well. It's the mind carried beyond itself, shining, ecstasy. And also trembling, sobbing, wrapped in silence. I can assure you, lovers of God, that sometimes these experiences are not comfortable. They're not joyful. Sometimes these experiences are painful. But not a bad pain, a removal. A searing, but in a good way. So Francis reminds us that these ecstasies, they're not an escape, but it's being transfigured. Being transfigured until what? Until Christ shines through us. I've given you many analogies through the time we've had here on the podcast, right? Catherine of Siena. Every episode I bring it up. The soul is the mirror of God. Sin, selfishness, ego, it smudges the mirror of our soul. Our goal is to remove the smudges through prayer, the sacraments, acts of charity, until our soul mirrors Christ. Mary in her Magnificat, Magnificat anima mea Domino, my soul magnifies the greatness of God, shines forth the greatness of God. She was so full of grace that she bore Christ. We are called to do the same. St. Paul says that, or alludes that our soul is veiled. We must thin that veil through Christ until what? He can shine through. The Transfiguration on Mount Tabor, Christ is radiant, and you and I are called to be radiant with Christ as well. So that is the goal. And in his prayers, in his intimacy with Christ, he burned with him. And he radiated Christ. He mirrored Christ through his actions, but also through the radiance of his soul. And this is also one of the reasons why Francis felt a kinship with Brother Fire in the Canticle. Because he saw fire as a friend, because it was fire that set him aflame by divine love. So where ordinary fire consumes, mystical fire, it purifies and enlightens. And in the cosmic priesthood, Francis, he would become both altar and flame. His body was the offering and his soul was the fire. But notice the arc here, from darkness to flame. We began with the dark night, imprisonment. We also had blindness, physical turmoil, humiliation. But it ends in what? It ends with a transfigurement, glowing, a divine light that pushes through. And we see that in the spiritual life. There's been some episodes where I talk about the bridal soul, and I know some gentlemen listeners, they're maybe not comfortable with being called a bride. But the bridal soul, it's a posture, it's not a gendered thing. The bridal soul is a soul so aflame with the love of God that it doesn't stop. It keeps going. It pushes past darkness. It pushes past despair. The bride in the Song of Songs, aflame with the love of God, searches for him. She's beaten by the watchman, gets up, continues her search. The foxes ruin her vineyard, gets up, continues her search. She has self-doubt, she hides in the cave, gets up, continues her search. And then finally, she is gifted with union in the garden. Mary Magdalene stays with Christ at the crucifixion when no one else does. Loyalty, runs to the tomb to anoint him, cannot find him, pushes past angels. Where is he? Where is he? She's rewarded with union. Christ calls her own name from behind her. Our Lady sticks with Christ through everything. Losing him in the desert, prophecy of Simeon, and of course, the entire passion, stays with him. She is rewarded with a coronation in heaven. This is the bridal soul, the soul who stays with Christ through the darkness, set aflame One could say that began in San Damiano and continues through the turmoil. And then Francis is rewarded, one could say, with the Stigmata. One could say with many of his consolations. One could say it's with the transfigured soul that sometimes glowed. But he was rewarded. But it started with the dark night. It started with that humbling. It started with that imprisonment. So that's the mystical pattern. The descent into darkness, it precedes illumination. This is John of the Cross, who taught us that the dark night leads to union. This is also seen in Hildegard, her visions of living light, that begins in darkness. The Eastern Hesychus. So you have these individuals who spoke about the uncreated light on Mount Tabor. We all have a light within us, and just like Christ transfigured on the mountain, we too are supposed to be more engulfed with the light of our soul. So, mysticism, though, it's not about airy visions. It can be. Perhaps you will be rewarded by a consolation. And I'm sure you will be. We shouldn't focus on that, and I've talked about that in a lot of episodes. But that's not the point. The point is not the visions. Francis did not do this for the visions. He did this to mirror Christ. So the point of our faith, the point of mysticism is not visions, but it's letting yourself be set aflame by Christ until your entire life becomes radiant. And Francis reminds us that ecstasy is both cross and fire. It is both crucifixion transfigured into light. So I actually had 2 more themes I want to talk about, but it's getting a little repetitive, so I might save those for the Patreon online retreat leading up to the feast day. But I do want to talk about his poverty a little bit, because his poverty was another way of mirroring Christ, right? Because Christ was born into poverty. And Christ was born into poverty, in my opinion, so he could relate to us and we could relate to him. He could have incarnated as a king. He could have incarnated as a divine being, but he came as a little baby in a crib. He lived as a simple carpenter. And Francis as well. He could have remained in the nobility, in the upper class with his father, but he chose to live alongside the lesser thans, the lepers, the poor, and so on. So we see that in the poverty as well. He actually called poverty his bride. He said he was married to Sister Poverty because he saw Christ in poverty. There's a lot more there, and I'll get into that in Patreon bonus episodes. But let's talk about the Eucharist. So Francis, his surviving letters, they're filled with pleas for reverence towards the Eucharist. And I also want to point that out, that Francis really loved a reverent Mass. Many people mistakenly think, oh, well, he was in poverty, therefore he was okay with kind of a simple liturgy. And perhaps that's true. Perhaps he was okay with simplicity. But a lot of his begging and a lot of his asking for alms was related to getting the best chalices, the best garments for the priests, and so on. But one thing he often spoke about was his reverence towards the Eucharist. And he would chastise priests who handled the host carelessly. He would urge them to keep it in precious vessels and to honor Christ's presence. Because to Francis, the Eucharist, it was not just a ritual detail, and to all Catholics. But the Eucharist is the living Christ. And what's important here is that Christ is humbling himself again. To Francis, the mysticism of the Franciscans is rooted in this humility. So here, Christ is humbling himself again. He humbled himself when he was incarnated as a small infant in Bethlehem. He humbled himself by being human at all. But he humbles himself once more in the form of bread, in the form of the Eucharist. He humbles himself in a way that we can unite with him. And Francis saw this as very important. To see the humility that Christ undertook. That's one of the reasons why Francis staged the first nativity scene at Greccio. He built the first nativity scene because he wanted people to see and touch the poverty of Christ. And it's said that during the Mass of the first nativity scene, Francis was rewarded with a vision. The little doll that they made to go in the manger was alive. It was the real Christ child. So Francis held it. And at that moment, he saw the connection. He saw that the other time we are that close to Christ is the Eucharist, and it's because Christ is humbling himself. So if Francis called poverty his bride, he called the Eucharist his beloved. And this reflects our nuptial mysticism, our bridal mysticism. Because in the Song of Songs, the bridegroom gives us wine and food and a feast. And here, Christ the bridegroom, he gives himself in the form of the Eucharist. So in the Eucharist, Francis, he met the same Christ who kisses lepers, who hung on the cross, who gave himself to death. Francis would write on the humility of God, "Behold, each day he humbles himself. As when he came down from his royal throne to the Virgin's womb, each day he comes to us himself, humble, appearing in the form of bread." So again, this reveals the Eucharistic mysticism. Christ's humility, it didn't end in the manger. It continues in the host. So here Francis, he links the cosmic descent, the incarnation, to the daily descent in the Eucharist. And just as Francis saw creation praising Christ that we talked about, he saw the Eucharist as binding creation together in Christ's body. So the cosmic priesthood, it finds its summit in the Eucharist. Christ lifting creation back to the Father through his flesh. So we are looking at matter and lifting it up in thanksgiving, but when we consume the Eucharist, we are uniting with Christ. And in that moment, Christ is lifting us up to the Father. And this is echoed in Bonaventure, who says the Eucharist is the axis of the cosmos. And he discusses how the Eucharist is where heaven and earth unite. So, Francis, in his mysticism, it invites us to approach the Eucharist not as this routine, but as an encounter. The manger in our midst, and the cross on our altar. To reverence the Eucharist is to enter Francis's mystical gaze, seeing the beloved humble and hidden in the Eucharist, offering himself again and again. And again, I'm going to be a little repetitive, but the last one, and I'll just go through it quickly to reiterate, it's how Francis saw Christ in others, right? The kiss of the leper, which we already talked about. One could say that was his first mystical encounter. Before his conversion, he despised lepers. Now he hugged them and kissed them, and he said, "After I did that, I felt a sweetness in my soul." And that mirrors Matthew 25, "Whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me." So the mystics, they see Christ precisely where the world hides him. He's hidden in the lepers, because whatever you do for the least of these. We even see this in how he treated his own brothers. He did not really call himself their superior. He saw them all as equal. He called the order the lesser brothers, the lesser friars, because their life, it was not to dominate, but it was to serve Christ, washing the feet of the disciples. And of course, in the poor and outcast, he begged alongside beggars. He stood among the poor. He became kin with outcast. He embodied Paul's words, "Though he was rich, he became poor, so that by poverty you might become rich." That's a big one. Christ was rich in heaven, but he became poor when he incarnated, so that by his poverty on earth, we all might become rich in heaven. Francis is doing this again. He was born rich, but he became poor to spread the gospel in the margins. By lowering himself, Francis entered into Christ's solidarity with humanity. But it did not just end with the creatures of the world or the poor, but also in death. Christ was even in what he called sister death. And on his deathbed, he welcomed sister death as Christ. As Paul says, for to me to live is Christ, and to die is to gain. So death once feared, it becomes the final veil in which Christ is revealed. So mysticism, it's not just visions or prayers, it's how we see people. And I just did a big ranty video about how we are not called to demonize or dehuman one another, but to see the Christ in everyone. That is also mysticism. It's not just seeing Christ at our prayer corners, at our altars, in the Eucharist. That's all good and important, but it's also seeing Christ in others, in the least of these. Mysticism is how we see people, and Francis challenges us. Can you recognize Christ in this difficult person? In the forgotten one? In those who are cruel to you? Can you see Christ in yourself? In your own weakness? So to be a mystic is to live Matthew 25 with Francis's eyes. So this has been a bit of a longer episode. But Francis was not just this mystic for nature. He was not just a safe little saint that we use to decorate our gardens and our bird baths. He was a mystic whose life was set ablaze by Christ. Every humiliation, every embrace of poverty, every tear in ecstasy, every hymn to creation, it was all to lead towards union. So Francis reminds us, he reminds you, if you let yourself be little, if you let yourself be emptied, then God himself will fill you. The wounds of Christ will become your healing, and the song of creation will become your prayer, and even death will become your sister. And again, if you want to join me in praying a novena to St. Francis, please consider joining the Patreon. It will be a novena, but much more, a lot of content on this incredible saint's life. Or feel free to just purchase a novena guide in the description. Join me as we pray a Pater Noster. In nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Amen. Pater Noster, quies in caeli sanctificetur nomen tuum. Eveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum, quotidianum de nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, et nos dimitimus debitoribus nostres, et nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. May God bless you and keep you and shine his face upon you. And may you see him in all things. May you see him not only in all things, but in yourself, in your littleness. Strip away all that is getting in the way of seeing Christ reflecting in your soul and in the face of others. May St. Francis be with you. May he guide you, protect you, and may he pray for you and for all of us. Thank you again, and until next time.